welcome to Unitarian Anabaptist.
Yes, thank you for having me, Tom.
Oh boy, it's been a long while since we chatted in the beginning, and I've been waiting for a long time to have a real, genuine, self-proclaimed Anabaptist on my program. So here we go. So before we get into the interesting matter that you are involved with, could you give us an introduction to yourself, your family situation, how you were raised in faith, and kind of what you have as a foundational setting in your Christian walk?
Yeah, that's a great question. My name is Reagan Schrock. I currently live in Tennessee, here in the United States. Married to my wife, Trish, and I grew up actually in the conservative Mennonite slice, I guess you could say, of the Anabaptist worldview here in North America. We trace our roots back to some of the older forms of Mennonite in southern Germany, and they would have fled religious persecution, come here, 200 and something years ago. And
Wow.
so that's a pretty direct line from that into the conservative Mennonite world here in North America. So that's my primary church experience. Since then, I've went on to a number of Bible colleges and studied and traveled quite a bit and rubbed shoulders with some other forms of Christianity, but that would be still what I identify with today. That's my current church situation. And
So-
a little, or actually, is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe describe just what makes an Anabaptist different from a typical evangelical or Protestant Catholic Christian. What values do you have that distinguish you as an Anabaptist Mennonite?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, especially when we use terms like Mennonite, that's very broad. There are many different forms of Mennonite around the world, and so it's kind of hard to pin it down. I think this is pretty common in most denominations. So I like to use actually the terminology Anabaptist because Anabaptism is not really a denomination. It's a worldview. It's a hermeneutic. It's a way of reading the scriptures. And we see this starting in the early 1500s during the Protestant Reformation, where they were saying, okay, there's some good things happening here in the Protestant movement, but they're missing some key elements, so it kind of splintered off. So you had the Catholics and Protestants being the two main parties, I guess you could say, in that time, and then
Yes.
the Anabaptists were kind of called like this third way, this kind of odd, different. They tended to. I'm not an expert on this compared to a lot of historians, so definitely go do some research. There's some fabulous books on what is the
Sure.
Anabaptist
That's
worldview
okay. Yeah.
and things. But yeah, a lot of those key principles of saying, we believe Jesus' teachings apply to us right here and now. Things like love your enemies, turn the other cheek. We take that literally, like we believe in a peaceful view of God's kingdom. Among many other things, community is a really strong emphasis. And so out of the Anabaptist worldview and hermeneutic, you start getting the Mennonites, the Amish, the Hutterites, different forms of the Brethren. Church groups come out of that. And so I come from that slice, the North American conservative Mennonite scene.
So, in your Anabaptist view, Jesus would be considered your Lord, your King, the one whom you are doing service to, and you take his words very literally. When he says, love your enemies, and the commandments that he gives, that you take it very literally.
Yeah, and that would have been one of the really key places where it split away from the Protestant movement all the way at the beginning and even, to today, where the Protestants were pretty aggressive about persecuting people who didn't agree with them back at that time. So a lot of the Anabaptist founders were killed for their faith by both Catholics and Protestants who would have said, we don't take that literally. And the Anabaptists would say, well, we don't believe in fighting back. So, they really believed that all the way to the end. And there's a rich history of martyrdom and laying down their lives for what they believed in up to today. Obviously, it's not nearly as common in today's world as it would have been,
Right.
500 years ago when killing people because they disagree with you is more common. But you still see it a lot in the American evangelical church generally, not always, but being more okay with things like war, and violence to bring justice, things like that. Whereas the Anabaptists would still say, no, we believe in loving our enemies. We don't believe in war, or as in, don't believe in war as in we don't participate in that.
Yeah. So the difference now would be that evangelicals would have no issue killing enemies of the state, perhaps, or people of other religions. And whereas the Anabaptists would say, no, humanity is God's creation. God created man God created man in His own image, and it would be sinful to take the life of another. So that's something that there's no. It's something that is a foundational truth that you hold to.
Mm-hmm.
And what about things like swearing oaths and things of that nature? You take the words of Jesus literally too when it comes to not swearing an oath and things along that nature.
Yeah, and it's really easy to, let's use oaths as a flashpoint, for example, because people will pick at that one and say, oh, you don't believe in swearing oaths, like what about, whatever situation. Yes, it's okay, don't believe in swearing oaths or whatever because Jesus says that, but it's a broader principle of saying when we say something, we really mean it, and we'll stay to our word. It says, your yes is yes, your no is no.
Right.
So like I work with Mennonites all over the country, and if I work with a Mennonite and it's, say, a business deal, very rarely do you have to worry about, oh, they're going to try to get you behind your back or go back on their word. If they say it, they mean it. They're gonna hold to their word. By and large, I'm sure there's always exceptions because we're humans and that happens.
Yes.
But by and large, that is a core cultural value. I said it, handshake deal. Like we will keep our word, and that's. And again, I'm not saying we do that perfectly, but that is absolutely a core value. And sometimes, like in my dad's business, that has gotten him in trouble. Sometimes people will take advantage of him. And he said, well, I don't believe in, bringing in law enforcement and enforcing, justice and like, I will make you pay, what you owe me. Right. No, because you know what, this is, there's just that sense of, we'll let God take care of those things. And maybe that's getting into a bigger conversation.
I will repay, saith the Lord, right?
Yeah. And
so that's...
I have people look at me and be like, oh, that's, really naive and things. And you know what? Call it what you will. Is Jesus says these things, and we do believe that applies to us today. And there's different theological schools and things that try to explain away, say, the Sermon on the Mount. Say, well, it doesn't really apply to us. Matthew 5-7, and we just come back and say, no, like we really do need to live this stuff. It's hard, and we don't always get it right, and I make mistakes all the time, but we want to do our best. We want to follow this.
Thank
we
you.
believe following Jesus and what He says. That matters.
Amen. So thank you for sharing that those details with us. So you have a very interesting calling that helps you project your faith into a different environment. And I don't want to be too specific, but I would like to give you the freedom to explain what that calling is and how you project your faith among people that really are in need of the gospel message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So there's actually two things I'm mainly involved in, and I think I'm not sure if this is how we got connected, or I'm trying to remember exactly, but through my other podcast called Anabaptist Perspectives, where we interview Anabaptist thought leaders.
I saw you first.
Okay.
Yes.
I thought that's what it was.
I saw you first. Well, I followed the trail. I saw you in the Anabaptist Perspectives, and then I followed you to your travels around the world, and part of the travels around the world had you in Iraq on some rooftop with some children, and I thought, well, this is very interesting. So you are a multifaceted person. I'm not going to share what your hobbies are. People can look into that, or you could explain it if you like, but that may be a personal matter. But anyhow, no, so I kind of got the Reagan Schrock perspective from the content that you have produced, and you're a well-rounded person. So I think a man that loves to travel, who loves to see beautiful things, cities in Europe, but you found yourself in a desert climate in some pretty harsh and perhaps even dangerous circumstances. So how does that happen?
Yeah, this is such a fascinating thing when I look back retrospectively at how these things came about.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the Anabaptist Perspectives podcast, which started with myself and a friend saying, okay, we have this thing called Anabaptism, but like, what does that mean to actually live it? You know, I mean, we live in America. It's very comfortable here. You can
Yes.
kind of live whatever, however, it doesn't really matter what you believe. If you want to be Amish or atheist or whatever, you can just, doesn't matter. And so I started thinking, okay, but what does it mean to live this out around the world? Because if this thing's real, how does that work?
Yes.
So it started out where I'd sit down and interview people, put it up on YouTube, anywhere you can get your podcast, you can go look it up and have these conversations. What does it mean to live this thing? You know, because we have these nice ideals. You know, Jesus says, you know,
Yes.
here's how to live.
Uh-huh.
But like, what does it mean to actually do that? Like, how does it affect our businesses and lives and things? So that was happening in one side of my life. And then another side of my life was getting really involved in a nonprofit working in Iraq, right at the height of the crisis with ISIS, the terrorist group, who was sweeping through, you know, northern Iraq. And at that point, it was mayhem. You know, it was anybody's guess how this thing was going to go down.
Yes.
So anyway, I had this experience with video. I was asking a lot of these questions, like, what does it mean to say, I love my enemies? What does that really mean? Because it's not like I am faced with that question regularly. Like, yeah, sure, maybe a customer will get mad at you, and you'll be kind back to them. Okay, whatever. But like, in real, visceral, difficult scenarios, what does that look like? So anyway, through a whole long story that I actually told on my newsletter, I won't get into it all here, but I ended up getting asked by an organization that was over there, that was working there, can you come and take some photos and videos of what we're doing to get it out to the world and say, here is this need, you know, here's this horrible thing that's happening, and we believe the church can rise up and help. And I did not want to go at all. I was like, nope, definitely not. I'm not going.
So let me ask. This was in the height of the crisis, the ISIS crisis.
Yeah.
You went there?
Yeah. So I heard about it right when ISIS reached their zenith. It is kind of debated a little bit, but it's somewhere in early 2015-ish, mid 2015, and that's when I was getting involved. Yeah. It was a pretty weird and wild time. At the time, they fielded one of the largest armies in the world. They had very advanced tactics and weaponry. So yeah, it was one of those scenarios where suddenly I was asking these questions of, well, what does it mean to live out my faith? You know, how do I do this thing called love my enemies? And then suddenly this opportunity to go to Iraq pops up, and I'm faced with like, do I actually believe this stuff? You know, I can say it nice and comfortable in North America, you know, but what about in a place where it's not really safe? You know, what about in a place where, you know, it's people don't like what you believe, you know?
So did you actually see the army of ISIS? Or did you actually see people who were involved with that organization, or were you just on the outskirts of there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I ended up going, even though I didn't want to. God did some things in my life, and I ended up going, and kicking and screaming. I like to say, like I didn't really want to go, but I go there, and within one day, I absolutely fell in love with it. Iraq is one of my most favorite countries in the world. Beautiful people, beautiful land, incredible culture. Some of the nicest, most hospitable people in the world. Of all the places I've been, they're just so kind. So it was really interesting because you had that in immediate contrast with ISIS, which is, at least in modern times, the worst genocidal terrorist group that we've seen. They're just unhinged, and I had to really wrestle with this. And it's so interesting that this is happening around that same time. I'm starting the Anabaptist Perspectives podcast, and I'm going around interviewing these people, asking these questions like, what does it mean to both love my neighbor but also my enemy? What does it mean to, you know, not resist the evil as Jesus says, how does all this stuff work? Among many other things, or even the Anabaptist core value of separating ourselves from the world's systems, like we call it the two kingdom concept, and that's a whole other thing. What does that look like? Because it's real easy when you're in Iraq and ISIS is right over there, and well, if the U.S. would just come in with their heavy bombers and their tanks, they would drive those bad guys away and liberate all these villages, and it would be all wonderful. Yeah. It's so easy to go down that street and say, yeah, we should be a part of that. But yet, as Anabaptists, we hold these values of saying we're not part of that worldly system. We don't participate in that, and that's really hard. So anyway, I'm faced with all these questions. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm going way around to answer your question.
No. I mean, to get it's difficult to get an understanding of, like, what is this that you experienced?
Yeah,
very dramatic.
Yeah.
as a white standout kind of American, I mean, you must have, like, you don't look like a Middle Easterner, do you?
No.
Or do you?
The red beard doesn't help.
Okay. Did you try to imitate their look, their clothing, and so forth when you went there kind of blend in, or?
So I've never been there long term, to be clear. I'm definitely don't want to say I'm an expert in Iraq and I know all. I really don't. I have some experience, but it's there are people that have done many more incredible things than I have over there. But yeah, I mean, you would try to blend in as best you can. You want to be culturally sensitive and whatever. But they loved that we were there. I again have a wonderful experience. The people were fantastic, are fantastic. Got friends there, and so forth. But I will say, when you get there, at that point we were in what was considered the safest region of Iraq. It was actually in the Kurdish region, in the northern part. Okay. And it was considered basically the safest. That's where most of the refugees were fleeing. They had, it was like a couple 100,000 refugees had poured in there in the last couple months. It was just madness. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. And wow. We were in the safest spot, and in the evenings, once the sun started going down, once the heat of the day was gone, we could hear the fighting starting to pick back up every evening. ISIS was, I don't know, it's like 20-ish miles away. We could hear the mortars and the 50 caliber machine guns going off and things. And we're sitting up there on the rooftop, just kind of listening to it. I thought it was thunder. Initially, I realized it's clear skies. How is this? And just thinking about, we're in the safest spot, and we can hear the fighting like right over there. Like, we're only 25 miles from Mosul, and Mosul was their capital at the time. Oh. And yeah, that really did kind of unnerve me. It's this thinking of, okay, I like to say I believe this stuff, and then I go here and I'm actually faced with, do I actually believe this? And that was really good for me. Yes. And I would say, if someone's really new to the faith and they're really wrestling with some of these things, you want to be careful stretching yourself too far too fast, because it can be a lot to process. And I ended up coming through that, and I learned a lot. And again, I fell in love with the place. So yeah, that was. They never got closer than about 25 miles or 20 miles. They were on the other side of the Tigris River, so we were on the east side. They were on the west side. And just before we were getting there, actually, they were so close to our side of the river, they were able to shoot people on our side across the water. But they had just been pushed back just before we got there, so they weren't able to do that anymore, which was kind of crazy, because we actually went down to the Tigris River then and thought, I was like, man, 2 months ago, like this would have been sniper fire. Like, this wouldn't have been safe. Anyways, yeah.
So you were in a place that was full of refugees and a lot of turmoil, and yet you were treated hospitably?
Yeah. I've traveled a decent amount, and I will say the hospitality that I've experienced in Iraq is the best I have ever experienced in the world, of any people group, of any place I've been. It is unreal. You'll go walk through a refugee camp, and they're living under a tarp, and they have almost nothing. They fled. At this point, they had fled few months ago, with just the clothes on their backs, some of them.
Yes.
And they'll come in and they'll be thrilled to have you, and they can't speak your language and you can't speak theirs, but they'll sit down and, use Google Translate or something and serve you chai and serve you supper, and it is unreal. They'll have nothing. You're sitting on, bare dirt sometimes and they have nothing, but they have, they can still share tea with you, or they can still share. Maybe they won't have enough food, and they'll go get some neighbors to help them make food for you. Like it's that level of hospitality. It's not nearly that dire now. Obviously, ISIS is pretty much gone. So fortunately, the situation has improved quite a bit. But I learned, again, one of the core values of the Anabaptist world, especially my slice, the Mennonite slice that I come from, is that sense of hospitality, of hosting people and having this strong community that supports each other and things. And to see how they did it over there was actually really humbling, because in some ways they were much better than I was. And that was something once I got married, then a few years later, that became a core value for me and my wife now, of that extreme hospitality, because I learned that from, my friends over there. And yeah.
So the fact that you were there, traveling so far, and actually on a mission of sympathy, trying to make things better for them, was something that they very much appreciated. And what did that enable you to do as far as explaining your faith? Did you have opportunity to share your faith in Jesus with these people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Iraq is a very closed, as we would call it in Christian speak, at least, very closed to other religions. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of it has to do with just general stability, because these things are very difficult issues. The culture and religions are so tied together. If that balance gets upset, it causes a lot of problems for the government. So they tend to be very hard on these things. But at the same time, what we found is, people are curious and they will ask questions, and they want to know, like, why are you there? And I've come to the place that, I don't want to force anybody to believe anything, of course, but if they want to ask, like, why are you here? Why do you do these things? I want to very freely share with them, here's why. And here's why I live like this. And I believe this is a better way of loving our enemies, of, this generosity of wanting to help those people that, are at that point at least having a very difficult time and just lost their homes. And that's a core value for me. I was there because of that faith. I probably wouldn't have went otherwise. And I think there were many times where I could freely share that and say, here's why I'm here, and here's why it matters. And then sometimes that was that, and that, they're very like, thank you very much, and this is what they believe, this is what that's fine. There were other times where they had lots of questions and say, wow, that's, one in particular, a family invited us over for supper, and we're sitting on the rooftop, and again, ISIS is like 25 miles off, and one of them could speak English, and he's like, this is my brother, and he's leaving tomorrow to go fight ISIS. And it's like, we don't know if we'll ever see him again. And they were saying how their people have been so persecuted by these terrorists, and how awful that is, and then wanting to know some of our story. And it was so interesting to see the response when I said, my ancestors were also persecuted and killed for what they believed as well, because they believed in radically following this person called Jesus, this amazing person that we see called Jesus, and he tells us these things, and that they could hardly believe that. They're like, you're from America, like, we didn't know, like, that happened to others. And it was this really neat moment, but at the same time I had to say, well, yes, but that was a while ago, so I can't personally relate to that. But they said, but you suffered for what you believed, or your ancestors suffered for what you believed, and they held to it, and they stayed firm in that belief, and that really mattered to them. And that was a really neat moment that we could share, even though they're from a completely different religion, completely different culture. I haven't seen them since. Who knows how their story ends? But that was a really neat thing that we can share, that it's because we believe these things that we are here and want to help you. And that was pretty neat. we got to pray with them. They prayed for us. We prayed for them, and
Wow.
they're like we prayed and cried together, and it was almost it was like a supernatural thing, and that's how I like to think about these things, because you do have to be extremely sensitive to people's beliefs, and sometimes those doors are shut. We don't want to talk about those things. It's too sensitive, and you don't want to force those things. But there were plenty of times when there was a lot of those kinds of questions, and we could share. Here's why we believe this.
So are the Kurds Muslims at the same time?
That's another great question. So primarily, the Kurdish people would be Muslim. There is an amalgamation of different peoples and religions within the Kurdish region. So you'd have like Assyrian people, which are primarily would call themselves Christian, the more like ethnic Christian, not like how you and I would think of Christian, but more of a almost like an ethnic identity. And then the Yazidi people group. The Yazidis are the primary people that we were working with at the time, because those were the ones that had been persecuted the most for their beliefs, because they're not Muslim. So ISIS considered them infidels, and it was really, they had a very, very hard time there for a while.
Those were the ones that were on the mountains. Some of them were on a mountain. Somewhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I've been, that's a whole nother story. But I went there then later on to Sinjar. So Sinjar is the region that the Yazidis that we had encountered primarily came from Sinjar, the Sinjar region, which is also the name of the main city there, and ISIS had taken it over. There was a mass genocide. There's 20-something mass graves of Yazidis there. They had very little time to flee. So they're fleeing across the desert, and there's this big mountain called Mount Sinjar. And around 80,000-ish, 80 to 100,000 of them ended up on this mountain almost exactly 10 years ago to the day that we're, or 9 years ago that we're recording this, actually. I think it was August 3rd, August 4th, so heat of summer.
I remember that.
Yeah, oh yeah,
I remember seeing,
yes. It was very intense, very, very, very intense time. Many, died from lack of water and medical care, and ISIS has them surrounded. I mean, it's a huge mountain, so they could hide and stuff. But they're up there for almost a week, and nobody could get into them. All the roads were shut. So a lot of the people I encountered with, you'd hear their stories, and it sounded like something you read in the news. Like it was like just like you saw on BBC or something. It was pretty crazy. They saw and experienced things that are way beyond our imagining, simply because they believed something different than what ISIS wanted them to believe, and so they were killed for it.
So how did this work of yours, how did it develop into something more than just, well, can you describe to us actually, in better terms, what was it you were actually doing in the beginning, and then perhaps how it developed into a more routine and focused work that you were engaged with?
Yeah, so it was basically aid work. We were feeding around, or doing, sorry, that's the wrong word, doing food distributions for around 5,000 people a week, which was a lot of work. I have a lot more respect for, we read these nice little stories in the Bible about how Jesus feeds the 5,000. Oh, that's so nice. Wow, feeding 5,000 people is a lot of work. That's really, really hard. So we got some really fun experiences there, and various aid things. We've done, a variety of things. We've worked with, a number of different organizations that have been in different different parts of the country, and some rebuilding of parts that had been destroyed by the war. Like I mentioned Mount Sinjar before. I've been to Mount Sinjar a couple times, and down into Sinjar itself. There was some rebuilding going on there. Those kinds of things. Again, a lot of that is kind of past. Like ISIS is mostly gone. There's still some rebuilding and things that are happening, but it's not anything like those early days of, you have 200,000 or whatever people flood the region, and you got to figure out where you're going to house them, and food.
Yeah, that must make it very difficult to feed 5,000 when you got 200,000 there.
Oh,
they probably all need food, right?
Yeah, like it was pretty wild. Like there were so many nonprofit groups and church groups and religious orders and all kinds of people came into the area and ended up working out, decently well. I'm sure it could have been done a lot better, but overall, the world as a whole came together and said, "This is really, really terrible," and we want to help with this. And I would say, the church, the global church. I mean, there were people from churches all around the world, showing up to that region to help out. And I would say that was one of the really shining stars of the church is when something like that happens. We're there to help, even though, okay, they're a different religion, they're a different culture, they're a different whatever. We can't speak their language yet. That's fine. Jesus says to love everyone and to help those in need, so we're going to be there. And I think that really simple faith that says, we don't just say, hey, I believe this thing. You actually go and live that thing. And, the classic thing, you put it into shoe leather. You actually walk it out. You say you care about all people. Well, do you have a way of living it, or is it just words? And I think that was a lot of actually some frustration I saw, too, with some of the churches where they would say some things and then they wouldn't actually do anything to act on it. And that's one of the things with the Anabaptists that I love so much. Again, my particular stripe of Mennonite that I'm communicating about, where they are very quick to get involved. There's a tornado, they're there. The Amish are there, the Mennonites are there, whatever. I mean, there are so many times, so many cases where people in our church or all the guys from our church will go somewhere and help clean up after a hurricane. Someone's house burned down, we'll go build them another one. We'll fly to wherever because they need help for 2 weeks, fixing this and that. There's just this sense that we will serve, we have something to contribute, or like we have something that can help, we're going to help. We're going to give. And that is one of the really beautiful things about the Anabaptist worldview, because I have friends in the military and things that were special forces or whatever, and they like to be like, okay, yeah, you say you don't love your enemies and don't believe in fighting, but like people like us are defending you so that you can have those freedoms. and hey, sure, okay, whatever. But I'll granted that's that's one way of looking at it. But I don't, for one thing, I don't need someone to defend what Jesus told us to do necessarily. I think that's a really important piece. But at the same time, when I get to know them a little better, like especially one of my really good friends was deep in the military and embedded with SEAL Team 6 and, some crazy stuff like that. Oh, wow. And then he found out what we were doing in Iraq, and it blew his mind. Like, he's just like, wait a second. Like, I did all this stuff with the military where we had guns and, safety and all this stuff, and you guys just went in there and just started doing this. That's nuts. Why did you do that? It's like, because Jesus said we should. And it really changed his paradigm to where you say, oh, you're not just talking this way. You live it. And I think that gets back to a lot of the core of where I was searching for. We say we believe this stuff. Do I live it? And I had to really wrestle with that. And oddly enough, it took a place kind of like Iraq and what had happened there to help me see that of like, actually, we can live this. It is applicable right now in the world right now.
So, do you believe that the kingdom of Jesus will be ushered into this world? He will establish his kingdom?
So that gets into some really interesting things.
The reason I ask is because when we talk about loving our enemies, it seems to me you're trying to usher the kingdom in. So, like, do you have the faith that you're actually working in a sense by doing the will of God, by obeying our Lord Jesus Christ? You're actually helping usher in the return of Jesus and the establishment of his kingdom in this world, in which peace will reign?
I'm not sure if I would have thought of it in quite that particular framework, but I would just go back to a quote from, I hope I'm getting this right. John D. Martin, we've interviewed him a number of times on our podcast. I think it was him, or maybe it was Dean Taylor.
He's been my guest. John Martin has been at my house. I had him.
Oh, really?
Last year.
Oh, fantastic.
About, 8 years ago, maybe, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, great.
He
Yeah.
also gave me. He also gave me and my wife and my two daughters a tour of Gettysburg when we were passing through. So I
Really?
know John D. Martin well.
Okay.
Yes, I
Okay.
love him.
Oh, that's
But
fascinating.
anyhow,
Yeah.
that's off the topic. So
Oh no, that's great. He
okay.
says something to the effect of, and again, I think it's him or maybe it's Dean Taylor. I'm not 100% on this. We are to be what is to become. So like we all know the world is not as it should be. I mean, there's plenty of redemption out there that needs to happen.
Yes.
But we believe as Anabaptists we are to be living out those ideals of what Jesus wants. That redemption is something to be lived out right now. We are to be what is to become, the full culmination of the restoration and everything that Jesus is going to do. But there's that other theological branch that would say, oh, no, that means the Sermon on the Mount is for that future time. It doesn't actually apply to us right now. And the Anabaptists, that's where we would differ and say,
No.
nope, we're supposed to do this right now. Even though the world is a mess.
Yeah.
Say again?
Oh yeah, that makes good sense.
Yeah.
If you're living out the kingdom now, then you're actually helping usher in that which is perfect. So, yeah, I think that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
That's my faith, in fact. So, but anyhow, I'm not the one being interviewed. Please,
No.
project your own thoughts.
That's really good. I guess I hadn't thought of it in quite that wording before, but yeah, I see what you're saying there. I guess I'm a little bit concerned anytime we look at a clear, unambiguous teaching that Jesus has and say, yeah, but because of this and this and this and this, we don't have to actually live it. It's a nice saying, but it doesn't apply to us. That scares me a little bit, for one thing, but it seems like those are often applied to the things that are the hardest. And again, this goes back to when I was having those questions, when I first started considering going to Iraq and things of how do I do this thing? Like I say I believe this. What does that mean? It's way more comfortable just to say, I don't have to believe that anymore. Like that would be way easier. You know how hard it has been on some of these trips into Iraq where we have been in some situations that have not been ideal at all. And I have to remind myself, I'm here because I chose to be here, because I believe this thing called redemption and loving all people and caring about people. And that's why I'm here. But it also means I may get myself into a spot and I can't just, plan on the U.S. military saving me or something.
No.
That is a seriously, I had to really wrestle with that and come to terms with, the Iraqi and Syria and some of these other places that have been in this loop of endless violence for a very long time. And that loop of violence, somewhere, that circle has to get broken. Well,
Yes.
The only way to break it is for someone to say, hey, guys, we should get out of this loop. Like, this loop is not working for us. The only way to do that is for someone has to forgive. Someone's got to be that first person that breaks the loop and says, you know what, I'm going to forgive. I'm not going to get revenge because I believe in forgiveness, and that is more important. And, I'm pretty convinced Jesus is the best option that gives the blueprint on how to do that. So for me to go there and then say, oh, yeah, but actually when it gets a little difficult, we'll come in guns blazing, and I don't really believe this stuff anymore. Suddenly that loop of violence that I'm trying to break, because I really want to see that for that country. They're beautiful people, beautiful place. Oh, if we could break that cycle of violence and let it be, those people just want to live normal lives, But if I'm in there trying to teach that, and then anytime things get a little difficult, it's like, oh, actually, never mind. I don't believe it when it gets rough. Well, do I actually believe it?
Just from what you're saying, I just can't help but reflect upon our Lord Jesus Christ as the perfect example of breaking that cycle. Isn't he the one that broke the cycle?
That's a really good point.
Yeah, he could have been a king. He could have rallied the zealots of the Jewish people. They were ready to rise up against Rome. He could have been that figure, but he didn't. He chose to proclaim the kingdom, but then he went to suffer and die for that very same kingdom.
Yeah.
And he had faith. Obviously, he had faith, that God would provide, and he believed God would raise him from the dead. And that's what he did, to establish him on high as the resurrected Lord. So, yeah, Jesus is our example when it comes to breaking the cycle of violence, and it seemed like you were just following in his footsteps there.
I thank you for your
without boasting, of course. Without boasting, but yeah.
I thank you for your confidence in that, but I'm pretty sure I'm a long ways away from doing it perfectly. But at the same time, I don't view it as I have an option to, because Jesus says things like, I'm sending you out, like, you need to walk as I walked. He says that, and he says, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves, or sheep to wolves. And did he mean that? Well, he said it. Like, do we believe what he said? So if he's saying that means, hey, like, this thing called living what Jesus tells you to do, this thing called Christianity, means it has some cost to it. Like, it's hard. And again, that's where me and my nice, comfortable little Mennonite church here in Tennessee in North America, where things are nice and easy and I can just get a job and live my life, it was really easy for me to ignore those hard questions. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that nice, quiet little church, whoever's listening. That is not what I'm saying. That's awesome. I am so happy that is the case in many parts of the world today. But at the same time, if that causes us to get complacent and not have to really wrestle with, do I believe this? What does it mean? And how will I live it? I think that's a case where we need to have some introspection. How will I walk this?
This experience that you had is actually experiential learning, is it not? Where you actually, in a sense, you proved there's a proving. You are proving your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, and the God and Father of our Lord and Jesus Christ is proving his faithfulness to you. It's a relational, experiential thing that you went through, and you're able to share this with others now, which you certainly could not have done if you just stayed in your comfortable little environment.
That's true. Yeah, that's a really good point. And
would it be possible? I'm sorry, if you have something more to say, go ahead. I have a question for you afterwards.
No, let's go ahead to your question. Yeah.
Okay, so you said you were in several difficult situations there. Would you feel comfortable detailing one or two of those situations?
Yeah, that's interesting. So probably the most interesting is being in Sinjar a few months after it was liberated from ISIS. I think it was a few months, something like that. I can't remember exactly when it was liberated, but it was still very raw. ISIS was about a mile away from our house at that point.
Wow, really?
Yeah, or maybe a little bit less. So if you go to the edge of the town, or a little bit out of the town, it was an active war zone. Like it was not considered a place to live. And if you go a little out of town, go to some of the various military outposts and things, and go up into some of the watch buildings, like they had different barracks and things along. They had taken over houses, and that was their front line. And they'd use bulldozers to build these huge walls of earth that were, 15 feet high or something, with sandbags and machine gun nests and things all along this front line that went for miles and miles and miles and miles across the desert, all the way down towards Mosul and beyond. And so this is Sinjar, so this is up closer to Syria, Turkey. So we went to that front line, and we climbed up into one of the buildings, and they were happy to show us around. They gave us tea. It was like you would have thought we were hanging out any old place. It was kind of wild. It's all very nice and quiet, and you can get up to the top of the house and look, because they have open roofs up there, which I love about Iraq, by the way, the flat open roofs where you can get up in the evenings and look out. Oh, yeah. And we were looking out across a field of wheat, and you can see houses out there, and we're talking close. This is not easily visible. And they're like, oh yeah, that's ISIS, Daesh, as they say, that's Daesh over there. And really, so we can look down and see their houses right there. Now, we didn't see any people. I don't know why, maybe they're just hunkered down, but they were like, oh yeah, they're in there. He's like, yeah, last week, they were out here with combines, harvesting the wheat, right in front, right there. And you could see, they're oh yeah, that's that road out there. That's one of the main, transit roads down to Mosul, where they smuggle things and move people around and stuff. And And they said, yeah, if we had better weapons, we could shoot that far. But their weapons were terrible, and they neither side could fire accurately that close. But like just down that line earlier that morning, because we were there in the morning. Earlier that morning, ISIS had crawled up in the night and attacked that position at dawn. A few hours before we were there. So yeah, I mean, it was an active, active zone. And that was really, really interesting because the group I was in there with was doing some work on how do we get these homes ready for people to move back in, for refugees and things that had left because ISIS was going to be pushed out. It was only a matter of time. But yeah, that was pretty crazy, and you had to be really careful, like where you walked. There was a lot of unexploded ordnance, and landmines, bombs, unexploded bombs that had landed, grenades, things like that. We found some mortars on top of someone's house, and it was just it was a very odd experience. I'm not sure I was like super afraid necessarily. Like we had some mortar rounds come in, that one day. They didn't land close or anything, but it was more what messed with me is being in that house with some of those soldiers, and they knew why we were there. Like they knew, this is obviously we're not here to fight or whatever. Like we're here to help civilians and things. But you could look out and see, without a shadow of a doubt, there are people in that house or those houses or wherever. It was like a small little village out there. Yes. No question. If they could get to me, they would absolutely kill me. No question. Yeah. Or they would put me for ransom and then probably still kill me. Like, it was a very weird experience that I can't really put that into words, but like it does something to your brain, and it teaches. It helps.
Half a mile away.
Oh,
that's what you're saying.
Barely that.
What you said?
It was probably closer than that. I mean, I mean, you could clearly see their houses and stuff. They didn't have a flag flying. I really wanted to see an ISIS flag. I've actually never seen an actual ISIS flag in real life. It was close enough you could have very easily seen it. But
black and white flag.
Yeah, the black and white flag. They didn't have. There was a pole there, but I guess they took it down, or I don't know what was going on. But yeah, we were easily close enough. You could have noticed like identifying markings and things like that. Yeah, so that's hard to put into words, but it helped me kind of get a glimpse into human nature and to realize, humanity is really broken. Really, really broken. And it's very deceived often, and there are people right over there that passionately believe they are serving God. They passionately believe and care and want their vision of how they think God wants them to make the world to come to pass. They really believe that. And on my side, there are people saying the exact same thing that also believe in God and passionately believe those people are the enemy and they need to be wiped out. And I'm like, oh, humanity is so broken. It is in such need of redemption. And where's this redemption going to come from? And again, I got to keep coming back to that cycle of violence. Like someone has to take that step and say, I'm going to forgive. I will choose a different way. I believe in redemption. I believe that people can change. I believe those ISIS fighters can change. They could choose a different path. I really believe that.
Yes, I do too.
There's a bit of fatalism actually in American society in some ways, which is kind of weird because we're such an individualized, be whoever you want to be. But there's also this sense, I'm just kind of this way, and this is just who I am. And it's like you can choose to follow a better path in the case of these terrorists, and that has happened. To be fair, I mean there are absolutely many ISIS members that have left that and seen how horrible it was and changed their beliefs. So yeah, I would say that was one of the odder experiences that really helped me see that it brought me stark, like face to face with evil. And we saw horrible things in that town. I mean, the mass graves, were right there. And, there was clothing and remains from people who had died in the genocide. And there was, bombs laying around and blown up houses everywhere. And it's just like, man, humans did this to each other, and that's so sad. And wow, we are so broken and we need redemption so bad, and I don't have all the answers, but if I can be a conduit to the person who does have the answers, in this case, Jesus, I think that's something worth doing. Even if that's if there's personal risk involved in that, Jesus doesn't really talk about personal risk being one of the factors of sharing that message, and so.
It's a beautiful, beautiful account, and something very much to be appreciated. So, Reagan, could you explain to us how your experience there has led to other possibilities for helping these people in Iraq and just for continuing the love in that direction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not just Iraq. I've been to other places in the Middle East as well, and I look at places like Syria or Afghanistan or Yemen, Somalia, some of these really bleak situations, and I travel in some of those places, and you realize, the average person that you meet is just that, a normal person trying to live a normal life and take care of their family, and they don't want all the drama and the mess and so forth. And if I believe if Christianity works and the church really has something special here, which I'm utterly convinced that it does, the Christian church has something really unique. And even if you're an atheist, that is something that is true. You need to consider that there's something going on here within the church that is really, really, and even if you don't agree with it, it's special. And I would like to say that if what we have is special, if we have something unique here, it should work anywhere in the world. It really should. So why could it not work in a place like Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever? And I think that's maybe me just putting out a bit of a vision for the future of God's people. Not to go out there and be like, we're going to fix everything. We can do it. No, that's not what I'm trying to say. But if we really believe we've got something here that is redemptive, that is restorative, that can break that cycle of violence, that can bring forgiveness into the world, why aren't we taking it to these, what I would call hard places, difficult places, dangerous places, as the case may be? Again, Jesus never gives a qualifier on there that says, hey, take my message of loving your enemies and doing good to everyone and helping people, but only take that to the safe places. You don't worry about going to the hard places. That's okay. Someone else will do that. He never qualified that. And if you look at, all the disciples of Jesus afterwards, they all were martyred for their faith, except for John, and he was exiled, and maybe we should take note of that. And again, I keep referring back to my own heritage within the Mennonites and the Anabaptist tradition, and how so many of our ancestors were also persecuted for sharing what they believed, and said, we do not believe in violence. We believe in forgiveness and redemption, and they were killed for that. Many of them were killed, and many throughout church history, especially in the Roman, during the time of the Roman Empire, many people were killed for that. And, Jesus never said it'd be safe, but he did say that we have something special here, and, maybe we should be willing to share that around the world. And again, I want to be really sensitive here and not say, we can fix everything and everybody should just believe like us, and we should force them to believe like us. And that's not really what we're going for here. But
it's never a forced. Faith in Jesus can never be forced upon anyone against their will.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like saying, especially something like Syria, where that country is really broken. It's been through a lot, and the average Syrian person is done with that. They don't want war. They want a normal, safe life for their family, for their children. Can we not come into that and say, we want to help? Hey, here's another possibility. What about forgiveness? What about redemption? Where does that play into the picture? And I want to be really careful that I'm not, downplaying what these people have been through and how difficult these things are. Of course not. I don't want to do that at all. But I would love to see another option on the table that is different from the current option. And the current option is simply keep fighting. Just fight. That's the only thing we know. So let's just do violence because this person killed my family, so I'm going to kill their family. Like somewhere, somebody has to make that first step that said, I'm going to forgive instead of take revenge. I mean, it's pretty classic, but it said, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. And that's pretty true. I mean,
Yes.
and Jesus said, don't do that. Nope,
Yes.
won't work. And I really do believe that. Yeah, I really do.
It becomes very, very clear that military options never solve problems. In the long run, I just happen to think right now the war between Russia and Ukraine is so intense, and now the world is going to starve for grain because these people can't stop fighting, and it's and adding more weaponry and more violence and more sophistication to these killing machines doesn't solve the problem. It's hard to believe in this modern age that that's all that nations know how to do. I mean, that that's the primary thing that nations do to solve problems is use force and a lot of sophisticated weapons of destruction. Yeah. So I really appreciate your willingness to serve Jesus in this capacity, and it's a beautiful testimony you have. Is there something else that you would like to add to the conversation? Some thoughts that you have in closing, perhaps?
There's some really complicated things that have happened with the different wars in the Middle East and so forth. And when we were there the one time, we were sharing some of our background as not just Christians, but from that Anabaptist worldview, because there was some pretty intense feelings about the U.S.'s involvement with these different wars and the rise of ISIS, which kind of comes from the U.S. withdrawing from Iraq, but then also kind of started because the U.S. it's just really complicated and really messy. I actually teach a course on this about that history, and to be able to have that conversation with that person and be completely not in that conversation. Like, I'm carrying a U.S. passport, but like me, my family, my ancestors, nobody in the whole line of my Anabaptist heritage has had anything to do at any point that I know of, at least, with any of the wars in history. And I told him that. I told this fellow that. He was flabbergasted. He could hardly believe it. He's like, you choose not to be a part of that. That's like, he about couldn't get his mind around it. He's like, your people did, like, it was so liberating.
That detail is fascinating because it actually allows you to project something that is just amazing. That you do not have, you're not affiliated with the empire, any empire of this world. You are affiliated strictly with the kingdom of Jesus Christ, you and your ancestors. And that's a pass to get you into places and conversations that you really couldn't have otherwise.
I mean, he was pretty surprised. Yeah, he was pretty surprised, and
you can imagine.
Yes. And it's like, you weren't a part of that. Like, wow, and I want to be fair and clear. I do carry a U.S. passport. I'm a citizen of this country. I think America's a great place to live. I live here. I enjoy living here. I don't want to slam America as kind of a trendy thing to do right now too. I'm not interested in going down that street. There's no point in that. But there was something about the consistency of our belief system. You go back through history. My ancestors did not support slavery during the Civil War. They also didn't fight for either side. Now, I would say I'm pretty happy about that. That was a pretty complicated, pretty nasty, war that happened. Don't have that problem. My great grandfather was a conscientious objector during World War I. He was drafted. I can't serve. I can't fight. My grandfather, who just passed away this year, was one of the last surviving Sea Cowboys after World War II, an aid group that we're not going to fight, but we'll help rebuild from the war. We'll go serve.
Sea Cowboys.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful story. Look at it's kind of a niche piece of history, but look it up after World War II. My grandfather was part of that,
Okay. Huh.
and it's just this rich story of. I think that's the one thing. If I was going to end this with on any note, is people hear about the Mennonites and you don't believe in war, you believe in loving your enemies. Oh wow, that's just pie in the sky. So you can sit back on your nice little farms in Lancaster County and be Amish. And here we are, struggling to keep this country safe and and whatever, and that's it. And I look at what Jesus says, and it's not a passive thing. It's not a thing that says, "Oh, we're not involved." And that's where I have a little bit of a pick with passivism, because it comes from that root word of passive. And I see what Jesus is teaching us as saying, it's not passive. It's aggressive enemy love. Like we love all humanity passionately, and we care, and it changes how we live. It's not a sit back, twiddle your thumbs, and say, well, there's nothing we can do. That's absolutely not what Jesus teaches us. And so I'd love to see the church, and I think the church already does do an amazing job at this, but I'd love to see even more of passionately serving all people, even if they're your enemy. And I have some really interesting stories about that, meeting some enemies in Iraq, and it doesn't matter.
You know what?
We're supposed to love them.
Would you be able to share one of those stories too?
Yeah. I should. I definitely should change the name on this one.
Okay, absolutely.
What ISIS did when they rushed through Sinjar, which is primarily a Yazidi area, so they're massacring basically the adults and keeping the women for themselves, but they would keep the children, like the young boys. I think the ages were like 12 or younger, or 11 and younger, they would keep them, brainwash them for like a year, 2 years, something like that, train them to be fighters, warriors for ISIS, which is crazy because they're they're brainwashing these kids to the point that they're willing to actually fight against their own people now, and become Muslim and become like it's really dark, and there's a lot of stuff on the internet now. So there was many hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of young men that were drafted, brainwashed like this. And as ISIS was losing territory, especially in more in 2017, 18, and 19, some of these young men would escape and come back, obviously very confused. Some of them wouldn't. And there was a case where there was three brothers, and there was a chance for them to escape. I'm sorry, no, two brothers. There was a chance for them to escape, and one of them did, and the other one said, no, ISIS is my family now. I will stay here. I will die here. I believe this. So the one flees. He's fought for ISIS for a couple years. He flees, comes back, and we know his mom, his father had been killed, and they're taken to safety, and it's great story ends there. And this other brother disappeared. We're like, well, he's still with ISIS. He did not want to come back. And towards the very, very end in 2019 in Baghouz, Syria, the last physical stronghold of ISIS, there was just a few thousand fighters left in this tiny little village. And one day they're like, hey, remember that other brother who chose to stay? He's back. And he's like a 3-minute walk from our house. Oh, wow. And this is a young man who has fought for ISIS for, what would that be now? 5 years. Totally brainwashed.
So was he 17 years old?
I can't really reveal his age because I don't want to identify him. But he was pretty. I mean, he was old enough to know better. Very clearly, he was not a little boy anymore. He has been with him for 5 years, and he was the one who had chosen to stay. I'm not leaving ISIS. They're my family now. Or he said something like that. And so we're like, hey, he just returned last week. Let's go visit him. And that was one of the weirdest experiences that I have ever had, because that was another case where come in, we're sharing tea. I'm literally drinking tea with an ISIS soldier. This he was not a curious, he was a fighter, from what we can tell. I mean, of course, he wouldn't really say because he didn't want to incriminate himself, in any court hearings and stuff. But he was free, he was freely whatever. And we're drinking tea with this guy, and he'd stand up, shake your hand, you're right in the eye, just really hard man. And I was like, man, this is right down the street, And I'm sitting there, and all I can see is a horribly, terribly confused young boy
Yeah.
who lost his way and was
Yeah.
brainwashed and terribly confused, and who really believed for a long time that he was doing the right thing. He had been wounded, multiple times. He had just had his back broken by a bomb from the U.S. government, which was really weird because he's like, yeah, they just tried to blow me up, and they took me to the hospital and fixed him. He was still wearing the back brace, and he had the X-rays, and he had like pins sticking out of his bone, like the bones in his
Oh,
leg
yeah.
and stuff, because his leg had been shattered and stuff. And he
Uh-huh.
was showing us pictures of it, and it was just like, okay, a week ago, if I would have been where he was stationed in Bagu, Syria, he probably would have killed me. No, quite. Probably. I mean, I can't see why he wouldn't have. And here we are, a week later, okay? And I'm having tea with him, and we're sharing stories. What changed? He's the same person. I'm the same person. But all my friends in the military would have 100% the week before shot him. No question. He was an enemy combatant, an evil person who needed to be wiped off the face of the earth in their worldview. And here I'm sitting down having tea with this young man. And I was like, you know what? His story isn't over yet.
No.
His story isn't over yet. And how could I say, yeah, he should be killed? And it just really, really rattled my world. And, his story isn't over yet. And he went through, after we were there, he went through a really dark time of very confused, very, very depressed, because he realized, like, I messed up. I got it wrong. And how will his story end? And I hope and I pray that there's redemption, in that story. I wish I could say that there was, and there are cases. Again, there's absolutely cases of that where there is real redemption that comes from these guys who absolutely, my friends in the military would have shot them on the spot, and now they're upstanding, good citizens that are great young men. And I think that can happen. That change is real. It is real, and I think it's something worth fighting for, and I really care
And,
about it. And
and God,
there's
God
more
loves
to it
that.
than
Yeah.
we can't
God
just be
loves that
like,
human being.
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. And instead of saying here's something evil to be eradicated, here is something that yes has some evil in it for sure, but
Sure.
here is something that it can be loved and can change, and can be
Yeah.
redeemed. Um, and I really hope that for that young man, because I believe he's still over there. I'm actually I've lost track with him since. That was a number of years
Okay.
ago now. So
It reminds me of a case in the church that I was baptized in Windsor, Ontario. There was a man that had attended church with his wife for many, many decades, and this gentleman was probably an SS soldier who had committed atrocities during the Second World War. And for the longest time, he could not believe that God was capable of forgiving him. And it happened, I think, when he was 90 years old that he came to faith in Jesus, believing that he could be forgiven for
wow,
his former sins. So,
wow,
yeah, that was.
wow.
But there definitely is hope, and it's just it's so clear to me that the love of God is reaching out to every single person, ready to forgive, ready to restore, ready to redeem. It's just a matter that we have to believe it, and sometimes our past is the biggest thing we have going against us, perhaps, to come to that knowledge and truth in Jesus. That's why people like you are so important, to bring that message, and to show that their life is worth something, and that there's a reason why they didn't perish during all this. I mean, this young man could have certainly died with all the attempts that were made to destroy him, and he came out wounded, as you mentioned, but where there's life, there's hope. And this is, yes.
Yeah.
So, well, it's been a very dear time that we've spent together. Real pleasure listening to your stories. I didn't expect it to have so much rich content, but I see that this is probably a highlight. This is more than your hobbies and more than your travels to Europe. This is something that is real experience, and that has framed your character to a large extent. So thank the Lord and you for your willingness to come on and share.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Thank you for having me,
Maybe.
Tom. I've enjoyed
Okay.
this.
Okay. Maybe God willing, we'll see each other face to face at some point too.
I would
If you're
enjoy
ever
that.
traveling to Lancaster County, going through Ohio, come stop by and pay me a visit
I'll do that.
near
Yeah.
Akron,
I'll do
Ohio. Okay.
that. All right. Sounds good.
Okay. Well, hopefully.